Hello and thanks for visiting our website, rebuilderinabox.com. Today we're going to be rebuilding the 3G alternator, the most popular on Ford, from 91 through 99. Some units are used up until present day. Here we have the two different sizes and the two most popular units. The larger one is off the Ford truck, the high amp, and the smaller one is off of Ranger, popular on the 2.3 liter. The Ford 3G comes in two different sizes, the 130 amp and the 95 amp. These are easily recognizable by the two holes that are in the spokes. Here you can see the three sets of spokes, and inside the two ribs, which makes up one spoke, is two holes. That's the high amp. Over here you can see the three sets of spokes. Inside the one set of ribs is four holes. That makes it the low amp, the 95 amp. Even though most of the parts differ as far as physical size, they're similar in the way that they're tore down and rebuilt. And there are some parts that actually interchange, like the voltage regulator, brushes, bearings. First, we're going to be taking the pulley off with a 1/2 inch impact and a 15/16 socket. Take a rag and wrap it around the pulley. Then turn the alternator over and you'll see the voltage regulator right here, this gray thing. There's 4 T20 Torx heads holding it on. Take those 4 bolts out. Then we're going to lift up on the outside part of the regulator and pull it back out. Then looking down into the center of the alternator where the two brushes ride, there's where one rides, there's where the bottom one rides, we have what is known in electrical diagnosis as the aha moment. That means that you've found what the problem is. You can see this brush up here where it was contacting still has copper left, but down below where it's burnt black and this ring is darker than the other one, then you know that's where your problem was, and that's where the brush was failing. Then you'll see the 3 bolts with the 5/16 head that need to come out. Now we want to remove this rear plate by tapping backward. If there's a plastic extension post on here, you have to pop the lid off that and take the nut off to remove the extension post that comes on some of these. This one doesn't have one. You'll see the red battery post in here. The plastic insulator for the red battery post, that just pops right out. You don't necessarily have to put that back in there because if you have the post, the extension post that I talked about just a second ago, you won't have that. Now we're about to do probably the most challenging part of the rebuild, and that's get the front plate off of the stator assembly. You have to take one of the through bolts and put it in there, and then you can bake it in an oven for 150 degrees, 300 to 350 for about 20 minutes, or you can use a propane torch, and you want to heat up the sides of it all the way around, the aluminum part of the outside diameter. You would continue heating about like that for probably about 5 minutes all the way around evenly, and then start tapping on the sides. You can hear and see how hard I'm hitting it. You don't want to smash it. Just tap on it briskly. And what that does is it forces the stator windings to come out of the aluminum front plate. So what we're going to do is just opposite, and this alternator, this particular one, we're using it because it's one of the most common ones. It's on the F series pickup trucks. The two ears are on the bottom, and you have to drive this aluminum housing off evenly. So what we have to do is, opposite of the two ears, put a bolt in, one of the through bolts in, up at the top. Screw it down in a little ways, then you can use that to tap on, because we're going to hold on to the back half of it, this part of the black, and then tap straight off with the hammer on the other side. Tap a little bit on one end, and then tap on the other end. Then soon you start to see the stator appear out of the aluminum housing, and that's when you know it's starting to come out. And there's everything disassembled. The stator rectifier, where all the diodes are, is an assembly. These are all soldered together. The rotor that we have to put a new slip ring on, the back plate, the front plate, and the voltage regulator brush holder assembly. You'll see the bearing in the front plate with the bearing cover and the 3 5/16 bolts holding them in. Take those out. Sometimes they break. As long as you got one good one, we'll show you what to do. If you're having trouble getting it apart, you can spray your rust bust down onto the shaft. That'll help get the shaft out of the bearing. So now we have the bearing cover off and the 3 bolts removed. Turn it upside down, get a 3/8 extension and a hammer, and tap the bearing out. What I did as I was tapping it out is I took a couple taps on one side and then moved it over and took a couple taps and take it around that inner circle to push it out evenly. You can see the corrosion on the inner part of the front frame. You need to take a piece of sandpaper and sand that all out. Then take white lithium grease and spread it around that edge so that more corrosion cannot occur. Also, the corrosion came from the dissimilar metal on the stator, because this is a ferrous. Take some sandpaper and sand that off, or wire brush it off, or buff it off with a buffing wheel, and then put a little bit of the either dielectric or white lithium grease on that too. Tap the new bearing into the drive-in plate. If it doesn't fit in there for you, you can heat the bearing, you can heat the plate up in the oven, or heat up the outer race with the propane torch. When you're tapping the bearing in, tap only on the outer race. Never tap on the inner part of the bearing. Tap it all around evenly and look at it from the side view, because if one part gets higher than the other, it won't go in straight. It has to go in straight. And tap only on the outer race. Then put the bearing cover in and put the bolts in. If we're dealing with a situation where one or two of the bolts broke off in the plate as you're trying to disassemble, as long as you have one, you can do this. Cut your retainer where those lines are. Then just put the one in. If you broke one of the bolts off, you can do the same thing twice. All we really did was just cut this here and here with a hacksaw. The one thing we do highly recommend, though, if you have to do this, is to use plenty of red Loctite in between the bearing and the plate. Now we've placed the rotor in a vise, and we're going to take the rear bearing off. We're going to use a 1/4 inch by 6 inches section, put it sideways, and tap it off at an angle. Now we're going to take the slip ring off so we can put a new, what you might call a commutator on there. It's actually called a slip ring. As far out as you can get these before the riser starts coming up, cut right here and here, right at the very edge, before the other part goes 90 degrees down. Cut with a pair of wire cutters. There it is from the side view. Notice how I made my cut as far out towards the edge as I could, but not part of the part that's coming up out of the bottom of the rotor itself. I put a little bit of yellow paint on there so you could get a better visual. So you want to make both cuts right in that area. Also, you want to be careful not to cause any breakage in the plastic. There's plastic on the sides coming up through here that helps hold this. You want to do your cut so that that doesn't break. It should still be a rigid piece when you're done cutting it. You can move it just a little bit, but if it's broken and wobbly, then things aren't going to work out for you. Here's that plastic piece on the side that I was telling you about. Keep that as much intact as you can. Now I want the slip ring off of the shaft. So what I'm going to do is just take 2 big screwdrivers and tap them underneath. And when you pry up, stay away from those 2 sensitive areas that we just took a look at. So you'd be about 90 degrees away from them. And just pop up. And this comes right off. Now we're going to tap the new slip ring down onto the rotor, and when you get it started, you have to be very, very careful that it is perfectly aligned this way, so that when it goes all the way down, it goes right where it belongs. And what I mean by that is this area right here has to go exactly down in this groove. So when you're lining it up and you start tapping it on, don't look so much at the wires, but look at and concentrate on this part being exactly centered into this slot right here. So we're going to take a wire toothbrush and gently clean up the leads where they come up so that we can get a nice clean solder joint. Don't do this real rough because you don't want to damage the plastic that holds them in place. Also, you can clean if there's any corrosion or dirt on the grooves so that the slot of the slip ring fits right down into it. Then clean that up too. So what we're going to do is put a little bit of oil on this spline, a couple drops, and spread it around. Then take the slip ring, line it up exactly, and then use a 3/4 socket to tap it down on there. Also, looking at it from the side view, you have to stop way before this part of the slip ring gets down to the rotor bottom. You'll notice that this part is actually the lowest part. So there's probably about 1/8 of an inch clearance here, but you don't even want this to set completely flush onto the top of the rotor. Leave about a 32nd of an inch in there, because if you crack it, if you go just a little bit too far and there's any cracks in here, it's no good. So as you're tapping it on, and after you get it started with the 3/4 socket, you can even use a little bit smaller socket, it'll give you a better leverage. Leave about a 32nd to a 64th of an inch clearance between this area on both sides and the top of the rotor. Then we took a pair of needle nose pliers and wrapped the copper lead around the rotor leads. Then we're going to put a little bit of flux on it and solder it. Now we have a video in alternatorrebuildkits.com on soldering, but I can tell you quickly that the secret to soldering is to heat up both pieces equally. So you can see that both of my tongs are touching one of each of the two pieces. You need at least 200 watts for this. And you'll notice that nothing can touch. This is a completely insulated circuit from one slip ring to the other, going all the way through the coil. Nothing can touch the metal body of the rotor itself. Here's a little bit better look at the solder joint. There's the one, and there's the other one. You'll notice how the whole cavity is filled up with solder, but not so much that it drips off the sides. Now we're going to take some 80 grit or 60 grit paper and do a really nice job polishing up the slip ring to get any lines or imperfections out of it. Then we're going to take some red Loctite and put it in this area right here, up close to the bottom of the shaft. Put the front plate in a vise and set the rotor down in it. You can use the hammer handle or a piece of wood and a hammer if the shaft don't go right in, to tap on it up here and get it to go down in. Then we're going to take the rear bearing, set it carefully on the top, and then take a 3/8 socket and tap it down on. Now we're going to inspect the rotor and rectifier, because normally you can use these items over. First thing we're going to do is take a pocket screwdriver and make sure that all six sets of wires are pried away from the body of the rectifier itself. In this area right here, you don't want the wire touching the body of the rectifier. Then we're going to turn the assembly over and inspect the stacks inside the stator itself. If you want to, and you have access to a bead blaster, you can bead blast this area. Be careful not to bead blast any of the wires. But what we're looking for is any signs of so much rust that these stacks of individual laminations of metal have started to separate and become destroyed. Also, we want to inspect in this area up here for any signs of melting or overheating or darkness. It's a good idea for longevity to get as much rust out of the inside of the stator as you can. You can use a sanding wheel or a regular buffing wheel, or just sandpaper, or just a wire toothbrush, and do a lot of work and go in and clean as much of that as you can. Then paint it with something, some kind of a paint, it doesn't really matter what. Now we're going to inspect the diodes or the rectifier. First thing we want to do is visually inspect this tooth to make sure that that wasn't broken off when it got taken off the car. If it is broken off, when you plug the other piece back in, when you're installing it on the vehicle, use some silicone so that that plug can't shake. This singular plug-in is the one that's responsible for the idiot light. And if it shakes or moves in there while you're driving, the idiot light will come on. Doesn't affect charging because everything will charge fine, but that connection right there has to be good, or you'll have the idiot light coming on all the time. And we have 6 of these to inspect, and what this is right here is where the stator wires come up, and we have to make sure that we didn't hurt or disturb any of this as we were tearing it down. It's not really an area that would have heat on it naturally, but as you're tearing it apart, sometimes these joints right in this area here, here's the wire, and then this is part of the rectifier here and here. So the wires push inside these 2 clips, which are part of the rectifier, and when the solder actually joins them together. So you have to look at all 6 of those and make sure that those are all in good shape, just like these are. If they have been ripped, you can take a 200-watt soldering iron and then melt a little bit of solder on them and they'll be fine. Alright, let's talk about the diodes for a minute here. This is one diode. This down here is the body of the diode, where the silicone material is that actually does the rectification. Then this is called the stem of the diode, and it's going to go up into the rectifier and solder in right about here. So that the very top of the diode here, you'll see it sticking out. And what we have to do is check all those solder joints, and they'll be soldered in right around here. And then here they are in the rectifier, coming right up here. You can see the top of the stem sticking out, and there's 8 of them. So they all need to be, take a wire brush and clean them off, and you want to look for any type of a burn mark that would be located between the rectifier, solder, and the stem of the diode itself. They should all look like that one. You can see there's no burn marks or any type of little blackness or arcing between the stem and the rectifier itself. Now we're looking down to the side. What we're actually looking at here and here, and there's one down in there, is the body of the diodes themselves. And you want to see what kind of shape they're in, like that one there, to make sure that there's no signs of heat or warping or burnt looking. They should all look nice, like this one. That's the body of the diode there, and down in there you can see where the material is. Nothing's been hot or anything. But this one here, without an ohm meter, without any test equipment at all, you can see where that diode is burnt and failed, and it's erupting out through the top, and definitely a bad diode, and 9 times out of 10 it'll be very obvious under visual inspection. So this entire rectifier is no good. So in this case you would have to either email us or call us and order a rectifier, and we could solder it to the stator windings for you. They're not really real expensive, but the thing is, a diode failure in that case is not very common in this brand. Someone probably jumped it backwards or dropped a wrench on the battery. It's usually a result of cross polarity. So now we've taken our dielectric or white lithium grease and laced the inside of the front plate, and we're ready to put the new stator rectifier assembly back on. This particular type on the Ford truck, the ears go at the bottom and the post goes on the opposite end. You line up the 3 places where the bolts go in with the bolt holes. And just tap it down in until it falls down into place. After you get it down in, if the bolt holes still aren't lined up with the slots in the rectifier, then put the lid on. If you don't have a battery extension post, you can put the battery insulator back in. You don't really have to. And tap that down and put the 3 5/16 heads bolts in. Then we're going to reinstall the pulley pretty much the opposite of the way we took it off. 1/2 inch impact 5/16. Put a rag around the pulley. Take a minute and spin it. If it's got a little bit of noise to it, it's not going to hurt anything, but you want to make sure that it's fairly loose. If it's got some resistance in some places that seem to be hitting inside, you can tap it on the side, tap it around, and then retighten your bolts. Now we're going to put the new voltage regulator brush holder assembly in. Just set it down in there. Tighten up the 4 Torx head bolts. Then take a pair of needle nose pliers and pull the pin, and as you pull it out you'll hear the brushes click in. And you're done.